You know, it is true that times of great physical suffering can also be times of great spiritual growth. Suffering can test our faith, but suffering can also refine our faith. Suffering can also strengthen our faith. Pain, you think about pain, it hurts, but it also often opens the door. It opens the door for God to reveal himself in ways maybe we've never seen him before. And it's also a way that God opens the door for us to draw closer to him and to experience his love at a deeper level. We see that throughout the Bible, through stories, through teaching, throughout the Bible. And today we're going to see that principle as well at work in the story we're going to focus on today. So if you've got a Bible, I'd like you to turn to the New Testament Gospel of Luke, chapter 8. Luke, chapter 8. Luke, chapter 8. Today we restart. It's been since May. We restart our series going through story by story through Luke's biography of Jesus. And as I read, I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version. If you're using a different translation of the Bible, yours might look a little bit different, but it probably will look very similar or sound similar to mine. I'm going to make a few observations and comments as we read. We're going to start at Luke chapter 8, verse 40. Luke 8, verse 40 says, "When Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him." Now stop there just for a second. That raises a question. Where did Jesus return from, and where was he returning to? In the previous story, according to Luke chapter 8, verse 26, Jesus and some of his disciples had sailed across the Sea of Galilee, which was actually a very large lake. They had gone from the western shore to the eastern shore, to a region where the people were called the Gerasenes. And while Jesus was in that region, he miraculously delivered a man who had been for many years oppressed by a whole host of demons. And even though that man, obviously, who had been exorcised from the demons, he was overjoyed, most of the people in that region on the eastern side of the lake were not nearly so hospitable to Jesus. And actually, in that story, earlier in Luke chapter 8, they asked Jesus to go back to where he came from. And that's exactly what Jesus did. So now here in Luke chapter 8, verse 40, Jesus has returned. He's come back over to the western side of the lake. And the people in that community are actually very glad to see him, and they give him a warm welcome. Luke chapter 8, verse 41 says, "And there came approaching Jesus a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue." Now, some of you know this, maybe some of you don't. A synagogue was the ancient equivalent for the Jewish people of a church. Basically, it was a place for religious worship and learning the scriptures. And Jairus would have been a lay leader in the synagogue, and he would have been in charge of organizing their worship services, and he probably not only organized, but did some of the teaching. Verse 41 continues. It says, "And falling at Jesus' feet, Jairus implored Jesus to come to his house. He had an only daughter," and that tells us why in verse 41. It says, or verse 42, it says he had an only daughter. She was about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him, it says. Verse 43, "And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she had spent all of her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone." Now, even though Luke, the writer of this gospel, we understand from the book of Acts, he was a physician, was his actual occupation, but he still decides not to specify what her medical condition was. All it really says is that it was some kind of chronic bleeding. Maybe it was some sort of gynecological problem. Maybe it was a hemorrhaging uterus. And of course, back then, in those days, there was no such thing as a hysterectomy. Now, depending on what Bible translation you're using, the phrase "she had spent all her living on physicians," that might be in the main text of your translation, or it might be down below in a footnote. And that's because some Greek manuscripts include that phrase, "she had spent all of her living on physicians," and some Greek manuscripts don't include that phrase. But we know it was true that that really happened, because the same story in Mark chapter 5 clearly says that this woman, in Mark's version of the story, she had spent all of her money trying to find a solution to her medical problem and without success. Moving on, Luke chapter 8, verse 44 says, she came up behind Jesus, this woman, and she touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, who was it that touched me? And everybody, when all denied it, the disciple and apostle Peter said, Master, the crowd surrounds you. They're pressing in on you. In other words, Peter says, Jesus, how can you ask a question like that? You're here in the midst of this crowd of people. They're all crowding around you and pressing in on you. So it should be obvious a whole lot of people are touching you. Now leave it to Peter. Good old Peter. I love Peter. Peter and I share many spiritual gifts, like cluelessness, like foot-in-mouth disease. This is Peter. Peter decides, I'm just going to put Jesus in his place once again. This wasn't the only time that Peter missed the point and still decided to comment about it. When Jesus asks, who touched me? It's a rhetorical question. Jesus already knows the answer to that question. Jesus wants everybody else, including us, to know the answer to that question. Jesus is not talking about ordinary touching. Jesus was talking about a special touch, a touch motivated by faith, a touch that led to a release of his miraculous healing supernatural power. That's the kind of touch he was talking about when he said, who touched me like that? Verse 46 tells us, Jesus said, someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me. And when the woman who had been healed saw that she was not hidden, at least she wasn't hidden from Jesus, she came trembling and falling down before Jesus and declared in the presence of all of those people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And Jesus said to her, daughter, and catch the tenderness in that, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Go with the shalom of God on your life. Then in verse 49, it says, while Jesus was still speaking, someone from the ruler Jairus' household came and said, Jairus, your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. But Jesus heard this, and he answered Jairus and said, do not fear, only believe, and she will be well. And when Jesus came to Jairus' house, he allowed no one to enter into it with him except Peter and John and James. Peter and John and James, they became sort of Jesus' inner circle over the course of his ministry. And he also let in the father and mother of the child. Verse 52 says, and all those people who were gathered there around the household with the family, they were weeping and mourning for her. But Jesus said this, don't weep, for she's not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at Jesus, knowing that she was in fact dead. Now here's a friendly word of advice. Laugh with Jesus, never laugh at Jesus. Because Jesus will always get the last laugh. Now, this is probably not a literal laugh. After all, the girl had just died. This is a wake. This is not a time for laughter. So maybe this laugh was more like a dismissive, teenagerish rolling of the eyes. Like, okay, really? Or maybe this was a condescending chuckle in their heart that betrayed their disrespect and their disbelief in Jesus. Kind of like an Old Testament story some of you know in the book of Genesis when God told Abraham and Sarah that he was going to give them and enable them to conceive a child, even though Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. And it says Abraham and Sarah laughed because they didn't believe it. They didn't believe it could be true. They had never been able to have children. Maybe it was that kind of a laughter in the heart. Technically speaking, these people in this story in Luke chapter 8, they were correct. This girl was dead. She was literally dead. How do we know that? Well, verse 59 talks about where it says her spirit returned to her after she was brought back to life. That assumes her spirit had departed. And that's a biblical way of saying she was really dead, literally dead. Like Peter did earlier, these people absolutely missed the point. When Jesus says she's not dead, she's just sleeping, he's not speaking literally. You think about that word sleeping, that's used throughout the New Testament. It's a euphemism in the New Testament to describe believers who have died, believers who belong to God, whose souls are safe in heaven in the presence of God, and whose bodies are destined for resurrection from the dead by God to be reunited with their souls. That's what the New Testament calls people, believers in Christ, who are sleeping. Jesus knows what he's about to do in this story, and that's why he describes this girl as not dead, but just sleeping. Then in verse 54 it says, "But taking her by the hand, Jesus called, saying, 'Child, arise.' And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And Jesus directed that something should be given to her to eat." Amen. Think of how long it had been with what she had been through since she had had a good meal. Verse 56 concludes the story. It says this, "And the girl's parents, her parents, were amazed. But Jesus charged them to tell no one what just happened." Of course, even if the parents keep quiet, the news about this is bound to spread. Think about all the other people who knew that this girl had died, and then they would see her alive again. Do you think that all of those people were going to keep their mouths shut? And actually, in the same version of this story, in Matthew's version of this story, in Matthew chapter 9, it says the report about this event spread throughout the whole region. So it was not kept quiet. So that raises the question, why would Jesus tell those people who were right with him when it happened at that instant, including her parents, to keep it quiet? Well, you think about the life and ministry of Jesus. Sometimes Jesus tells people to keep quiet about his identity and his work, like he did here with these people. And at other times, Jesus encouraged people to share their testimony about him openly, like he did with the woman he healed earlier in this story. It's kind of mysterious why Jesus says one thing at one time and another thing even at a very close in time event. It's mysterious, but Jesus obviously has his reasons. A lot of Bible scholars think that when Jesus commanded secrecy, sometimes it was to prevent people of thinking of him as just a miracle worker, because he was so much more than that. He didn't want to get people fixated on his miracles. Another reason scholars think he told sometimes people to keep it a secret was he did not want to be used to promote people's political agenda and to speed up God's timing. We do know that after Jesus was crucified and resurrected from the dead, Jesus made it crystal clear to all who believe and follow him that he wants the good news about him to be spread far and wide. As we've talked about many times throughout this series in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, like all the other New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, basically revolves around three questions. And these are the three questions. Luke is constantly trying to answer these three questions. Who is Jesus? What is the message of Jesus? And what does it look like to have faith in Jesus? Who is Jesus? What's the message of Jesus? And what's it look like to have faith in Jesus? This particular story in Luke chapter 8 focuses on the first question and the third question. Who is Jesus? And what does real faith in Jesus really look like? So let's take a few minutes to talk more about that, to think more about how this story answers those two questions. Here we go. The first question, who is Jesus? What does this story teach us about the nature of Jesus and the character of Jesus? Like a lot of gospel stories, especially stories that involve miracles, the basic issue in this story is authority, specifically the authority of Jesus. Where does Jesus get the authority to say what he says and to do what he does? Is Jesus just a man who's just making this stuff up on his own authority? Or does Jesus represent and embody in flesh a higher authority, the ultimate authority of God? Earlier in Luke chapter 8, Jesus was in a boat and he crossed the lake with his disciples, and this fierce storm, some of you remember the story, this fierce storm comes up and everybody in the boat, their lives are endangered. Jesus wakes up from a nap, he commands the storm to stop, and the storm stops. And the awestruck disciples look around them on this calm lake and they ask, who is this man who even commands the wind and the water, and they obey him? That was a demonstration of authority, of Jesus' authority over nature. And once they make it to the other side of the lake, earlier in Luke chapter 8, Jesus encounters this man who for many years had been oppressed by demons. And Jesus delivers the man from his demonic oppression. That's a demonstration of Jesus' authority over demonic spirits. Now this story here today, this tells us that Jesus has authority in two other realms. First of all, the story about this woman teaches us that Jesus has authority over disease. Authority over disease. This woman, think about her. She had tried everything she could to get a solution to her problem, to get help, but nothing had worked until Jesus decides to work. For this woman, for the past 12 years of her life, that disease had ruled her life until Jesus decides to take charge and exercise not only rule over her life, but rule over her disease. Compared to that woman, you think about the day and age we live in, we benefit. We are blessed with all the benefits of modern medicine and medical technology. And yet we're not so different than this woman. We're still vulnerable to the ravages of disease. This pandemic has been a painful reminder of that. Whether the problem is infertility or cancer or mental illness or whatever it is, even if the doctor does it perfectly, even if the medicine and the technology are all in place and applied perfectly, there are never any guarantees that it's going to work. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But Jesus is different. Jesus, when it comes to disease, Jesus is not susceptible to disease. Jesus is superior over disease. When it comes to disease, Jesus is not vulnerable. Jesus is victorious. That's what he's showing here in this story. On another occasion, Jesus miraculously healed a man who had been paralyzed. And Jesus said on that occasion that his power and authority to heal the body was a sign of his power and authority to heal the soul and the heart. It was a sign of his authority to heal physically, was a sign of his authority to forgive people's sins and to make people right with God. And I believe that's also what's going on in this story of this woman. It's interesting in verse 48 when Jesus says to the woman, "Your faith has made you well." Luke doesn't use the word you would normally expect to see, the Greek word that describes healing that's just physical healing. Luke uses the Greek word sozo. In that phrase, your faith has made you well. Sozo. It's the same Greek word that's used to describe what Jesus said about the girl in verse 50 when Jesus tells Jairus, "She will be well." Sozo. Sozo literally means to save or to be saved from danger and brought to a place of safety, not just physically, but spiritually. You see, Jesus was literally telling this woman, your faith has saved you. He was saying to Jairus, she will be saved. Your little girl will be saved if you will only believe. So the point here is really bigger than just Jesus' power and authority over physical disease. What's going on here is a demonstration of his power and authority to heal spiritual disease, the disease of our sin that separates us and comes between us and God. Only Jesus can cure that disease. When Jesus gave his life on that cross, he took our disease upon himself so that we don't have to bear it and die from it. The story of this woman tells us that Jesus has authority over disease. The story about Jairus and his daughter teaches us that Jesus has authority over death. Authority over death. Woody Allen once famously said, "I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens." Someone once told me that as a pastor, it's my job on a regular basis to tell you that you are going to die. It's one of the best parts of my job. You are going to die. All of us are going to die. Last I checked, the death rate is 100%, 1-to-1. All of us are subject to death, except Jesus. Jesus is not subject to death. Death is subject to Jesus. Once that little girl in this story died, for all of those people, for those parents, for that mother and father, all hope was lost until Jesus shows up. Think about this. For Jesus, raising a person from the dead is like waking a child up from a nap. And that's why Jesus said about her, she's not dead, she's sleeping. Recently, I met a family with 4 children. And I found out that number 4 almost didn't make it. Because at one point during the pregnancy, that couple was told that there was no heartbeat. The baby was dead. And so the doctor schedules a procedure to remove the remaining fetal tissue. The parents are devastated. The parents are desperate. The father decides to start praying. As far as I know, he didn't even tell his wife he was praying. So before the procedure, they ask, maybe demand, another ultrasound. And guess what? Baby's heart is beating. And I met number 4. Was it a miracle? Or did the doctor make a mistake? Just like this story of the healing of the woman was about more than just physical healing, I think this story about Jesus raising this girl from the dead is about something bigger. There's something bigger going on. In the Gospel of John chapter 11, just before Jesus raised a man named Lazarus from the dead, he famously said this about himself. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me," Jesus said, "though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me," Jesus said, "shall never die." When Jesus raised this little girl, the daughter of Jairus, from the dead, he demonstrated his authority over death. After Jesus died on the cross, he demonstrated his authority and conquered death by his own death and resurrection. And the Word of God promises that at the end of history, Jesus will show his ultimate supremacy and authority over death by resurrecting and reuniting the bodies and souls of those who have died, who believe in him and belong to him. Several years ago, I led a funeral across town for a woman who was in my church at the time who had just died of cancer. And like other funerals, there were a lot of tears and there was a lot of grief. But at this funeral, there was also a lot of joy and laughter and a genuine sense of hope and assurance and peace. And you know why that was? It's because that woman had an obvious and genuine faith and relationship with Jesus Christ. And for those of us who knew her and who know Jesus, we knew that at that point she was safe and happy in heaven in the presence of God. And so that funeral was not like a typical funeral. It was much more like a celebration. And I remember that after that ceremony was over, some guests at the funeral came up to me. And the man said to me, "I have never seen anything like that before." You see, if you don't know Christ and you don't trust Christ as your Lord and your Savior, the prospect of death is and should be a fearful thing. Because without Christ beyond this life, there's no hope. But if you've put your faith in Jesus and you belong to him, there is nothing left to fear. Because your destiny in heaven, in the presence of God, is sealed, signed, sealed, and delivered by Jesus and made certain by the words of Jesus, who said, "Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." You think about this. According to the letter of the Old Testament law, contact with this bleeding woman in this story and this dead little girl would make an ordinary person ceremonially unclean, according to the Old Testament law in the book of Leviticus. But Jesus is different. Jesus is no ordinary person. Jesus is the Messiah King. Jesus is the Son of God. So unclean people don't make Jesus unclean. Actually, it's the reverse. Jesus is the one and the only one who can make unclean people clean. Because Jesus is the one who has sovereign authority over disease and over death. Second question, and we'll finish with this. The second question is about faith. What does real faith look like? What does genuine saving faith in Jesus look like in the life of a person? This story gives us two flesh and blood examples. One is the woman and the other is the man, Jairus. The woman is anonymous and presumably poor. She spent all she had. The man, he has a name, not just a title, but a name in the community. He's a public figure, Jairus. The woman has been suffering from a 12-year-old illness. The man, Jairus, is suffering because of the suffering of his 12-year-old daughter. Jesus tenderly calls the woman daughter. And then he raises the daughter of Jairus from the dead. Both the woman and Jairus literally fall down, it says, before Jesus and show genuine faith in him. But the faith of the woman and the faith of Jairus is very distinct, very different from each other. Think about Jairus. Jairus starts off strong and then he's tempted to waver. The woman, she starts off wavering and then she comes on strong. Let's think about this woman for a minute and her faith. Initially, this woman is shy. She's hesitant. Verse 44 says she approaches Jesus from behind and she touches only the edge of his garment. She actually doesn't make contact with his body. To some extent, this woman's fear is justified because, as I just mentioned, according to the Old Testament law, her condition of bleeding would make her ceremonially unclean. She would be a social outcast. She would be untouchable. By the letter of the law, she should be in quarantine. Verse 47 implies that even after she's healed, this woman tries to stay hidden until Jesus calls her out. And when she finally does come forward, it says she comes trembling. You see, initially, this woman's faith is anything but courageous, but we know it's real because after Jesus does call her out, she comes forward and she gives a very clear and public testimony about what Jesus has done for her. Technically speaking, many people in this crowd had been touching Jesus, but only this woman was reaching out and touching Jesus in faith. And that's why Jesus outed her. That's why Jesus calls her out, because he wants to expose her smoldering faith and fan it into flame, make it public. Some of us here today have a faith like this woman. We have a faith that's faint and smoldering. Jesus wants to call us out. Jesus wants to fan our faith into flame. And so at this moment, I have to ask myself, you have to ask yourself, is Jesus calling me out like he called out this woman? And what would it look like for me to answer the call of Jesus? And then there's Jairus. When Jesus shows up, verse 40 says the crowd is delighted, but Jairus is desperate. Jewish religious leaders weren't known to be friendly with Jesus, so as a ruler of the synagogue, Jairus is taking a real risk. But at a time like this, who cares? Who cares what people think when you have a little girl who's dying? Does it really matter what people think? Not when you're, and it says his only daughter, not when your only daughter is on her deathbed. As a parent, I've been with a child in an emergency room. So have many of you. As a parent, I've watched two of my children get wheeled into surgery. And I have to admit, I wondered, what if they don't wake up? Nothing hurts like the loss of a child or the suffering of your own child. So Jairus humbles himself in verse 41, and it says he implored Jesus to come to his house. That's not an invitation. That's not a polite ask. That's begging and pleading. Just a couple days ago, I was praying for someone in my life who means a lot to me, and just out of nowhere, I found myself weeping over this person. And then I found myself sort of bargaining with God and saying things that implied, God, I'd rather take this pain than this person to bear this pain. And then I realized, I kind of woke up and said, God doesn't want my bargaining And God already knows how important this person is to me and how important this person is to him. And what I notice about Jairus is there's no bargaining. He just believes that Jesus is his only hope. Someone once said this, and I think it's true. Sometimes we don't realize that Jesus is all we need until Jesus is all we have. Unlike the woman, Jairus seems to have no problem being bold, at least at first. The test for Jairus is, will he persevere? Can Jairus wait? Can Jairus wait when Jesus gets interrupted and stops to serve that woman? Will Jairus be patient and set aside his timing for God's timing? Can Jairus ignore the voice of the crowd that's telling him to give up hope and listen to the voice of Jesus who's telling him to stay the course and to keep on believing? Some of us here today have a faith more like Jairus. And like Jairus, we need to hear the words of Jesus in verse 50, where Jesus says, "Do not fear, only believe." We need to understand, or remember at least, that faith is more like a marathon and not a sprint. We need to live by faith and not by sight. We need to learn endurance and resist the temptation to give up. We need to listen to the voice of Jesus instead of the worldly voices of doubt and fear. It reminds me of something John Wayne once said. He said, "Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway." One lesson we see in this story is that faith is not the absence of fear. Faith is the choice to overcome and push through fear and put our trust and hope in Jesus. So let's choose faith over fear. You know, it's common for people to think in this day and age, any kind of faith is good as long as you believe in something. But think about this woman and think about Jairus and think about us. Real faith is not just faith in whatever you want to believe in. Real faith is faith in Jesus. Real faith is faith in Jesus and only in Jesus and trusting in him and following him. Real faith is just not hoping for the outcome I want. Real faith is faith in Jesus. Finally, God and the Word of God never guarantee that even if I have real faith in Jesus, I'm going to see the spectacular results that woman saw or that Jairus and his daughter saw. That's not the point of this story. This is the point. Faith in Jesus unleashes the compassion and power of Jesus to be displayed in our lives. That's the point of these stories, of this story. Real faith in Jesus opens the way for the compassion of Jesus and the power of Jesus to be displayed in our lives. Would you pray with me?